I'm Eleanor Wachtel, and I'm speaking to Roger Reeves about his prize-winning book, Best Barbarian. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. Great to talk to you.
In your acceptance speech, when you won the Griffin Poetry Prize, you said, I come from a small town in New Jersey, and I got there because my grandmother decided to leave the fields of South Carolina and begin to clean homes, that she was a domestic in New Jersey. Can you tell me more about her background, how she came to make her way to New Jersey?
Sure. This would have been the 50s. She had an older sister who had already went north, as the story is told, as history is kept in the family. And her older sister, my great aunt Anne, um, made it to New Jersey, wound up starting a business, starting a restaurant, married, and she was taking her new husband, who was Caribbean, who was from Trinidad, down um, to meet her family in South Carolina. And he gets there and he sees that these conditions they're living in are difficult, to say the least. And he says, we got to figure out a way to get your younger siblings north. And so my grandmother came north via her sister, her mother came and her father, and they started working. So my great grandfather and great grandmother came north and started working in north. And my grandmother was about probably 14, 15 when she came.
Oh.
And when she got to New Jersey, she finished high school in 2 years. So she was done by 16, and her father told her, this is a story I write about in my next book,
Oh.
book of essays, Dark Days. Her father told her, women can't go to college. You're not allowed to go to college. He said, if you go to college, you'll just bring the baby home and I'll have to take care of it. So you'll get pregnant and no college. And so my grandmother started cleaning houses, met my grandfather, who was a Navy veteran, and, that made life in southern New Jersey.
And you paint a vivid picture of your grandmother's influence, how she took you to the homes that she'd clean in these wealthier neighborhoods. What impact did that have on you?
Lots. It was my grandmother. It was really, I don't know if she said this to me or my mother said this to me at one point, but it seemed as if these books were tied to you not being poor anymore. And so there was a way in which the bookshelves, I sort of understood them as, okay, education is the way out. I remember my mother very early on telling me, like, you're gonna have to figure this out. Like, I remember being maybe 8 years old, and she was like, no, there's no funds. There's no funds to go to college. It's you and what you can do. And so I think between my mother and my grandmother teaching me sort of like, but they were always very keen on reading, music, sort of literature was really important to them. And they saw education as a way of possibly, changing one situation. And for me, I just loved reading when I was a kid. I'd read anything.
Was this before, because you said your grandmother would sit you in front of these, rooms full of books, and she would say, I want you while I'm cleaning to just look at these shelves, and I mean, do you remember what books you looked at or what you read? Was that your first exposure to such a volume of books?
It was my first exposure to such a volume outside of like the public library.
Right.
I didn't know that people actually like had their own books other than the ones you borrowed, right? I had kids' books, little thin books, but it wasn't, I had never seen books on that order, books like this, and it was my first exposure, but the books were always, they didn't seem very interesting to an 8-year-old, 6-year-old. They were, leather bound books, sort of, burgundy covers, but I was intrigued by the vastness of them, what I could sound out the words, some of the words like archaeology, anthropology. And then when I got a little older and I was still going to those same houses, uh, and I started knowing what literature was, that's when I started trying to pull off certain books off the shelves. If they seemed like once I knew what a chapter book was and what a novel was. And I think that's how I first encountered Moby Dick. Actually, I started reading Moby Dick, trying to read it. I think in fourth or fifth grade. That was my first attempt at reading Moby Dick.
That's pretty ambitious.
Well, yeah, you hear about it though. It's in the lore in American like literature, literary lore, and even in the filmic and cinematic lore. Moby Dick is like everywhere. You hear about this great white whale, the most popular of things. And so I had heard about it, and I was like, saw it on somebody's bookshelf, and I pulled it down and tried to read it.
You said that you became a poet because of poverty. How so?
I would, I love to make things. And when one loves to make things, as to make things, you need other things. You need other materials. And it was the cheapest art. You just needed pencils and pens. It wasn't like I love film. I love movies, but movie cameras and actors, and you need a production team. You know, all of those things. And this is before the iPhone, right? This is before uh, film was cheap. I remember working on an independent film set when I was in college, and I learned how much film actually costs, right? To actually buy film, right? And so I thought that poetry was this thing that was like I could entertain myself. No one could tell me that I needed more materials. All I needed was a pen and some paper and just my mind, right? And I didn't need anybody else. You know, I always say poetry is singles tennis. You know, and so you know, as long as you have a racket and a ball, you can play tennis, right? You can play against the wall.
I was just gonna say it's really singles tennis.
Really singles tennis. And so that's how I started. I just thought it was the cheapest thing I could do. I could tell stories that way. I also was writing short stories, but I could also just sort of create, you know, the music that's allow the music inside my head to get exterior to that.
You did go sideways at one point, studying mechanical engineering in college, and then you dropped out for a while before returning to university, and then eventually getting like a PhD in English literature. What did you imagine at that point for you as your career?
When I the PhD or when I dropped out of college?
No, well, start with dropping out and then the PhD because they're not. There's a little circle the way they get connected.
Yeah. Oh, so when I dropped, I was at a Ivy League institution. It was at Princeton, and you know, studying mechanical and aerospace engineering because my like again come from poor folks, and you know, be an engineer, be a lawyer,
You
do
got a
some
scholarship. You got a scholarship to Princeton.
scholarship. Yeah, we couldn't afford. Yeah, it was a really great one. You know, very, very large, and uh, but what was difficult was I was somewhat discouraged from pursuing creative writing at Princeton, and you know, you feel when you're 18, you feel pulled in many different directions at once. And I didn't want to be poor anymore. Um, you know, no one wants to be poor. And at the same time, I wanted to be a writer, but I didn't know any writers. You know, I didn't know that path and how to pursue it. And so, you know, I just kind of stuck with being a mechanical and aerospace engineer. Got very sad and stopped going to school, stopped going to class, and that's not good.
Mhm.
And so what I wanted to do was dropping out of school and pushing carts at we have a grocery store in the South called Kroger. Pushing carts at a Kroger,
Oh, I
and
know Kroger. Yeah.
yeah, then working at a gym, and just had odd jobs for a while. And I was like, oh, this isn't it. And I was like, well, maybe I should try to be a writer. And I started writing again. And I met my first writing mentor, Daniel Black, who's a novelist and nonfiction writer, and he teaches at Clark Atlanta University. And he was like, you should go back to school. And I was like, well, I just want to be a writer. No one needs. He was like, no, you don't need school, but I have a feeling you would enjoy it if you had the right major, and it's the best education in terms of trying to become a writer. Become an English major and you read everything you need to read. And so I went back to school at Morehouse College, went to Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia, uh, and it was transformative. It was a
Mm.
transformative experience. I worked with Dr. Black, I worked with Dr. Melvin Ramming, um, and all these really great scholars. And you know, the art community in Atlanta in the early 2000s was great. You just bumped around and you went to galleries and you snuck into places and did things. And it was wild. It was a wild time to be a young artist in Atlanta. And, but at the same time, I was like, okay, what do I do next? And that's when I decided to go get a master's degree at Texas A&M, get an MFA. And my whole thing was I was just going to keep getting degrees until I had a book. Right? You just keep getting degrees. It's, you know, like it was easy to live cheap. I was getting degrees in the South at the time. It was cheap to live in the South. It is no longer cheap to live in Austin and in the South. And so, you know, you could live really, really well on very little money and do a lot of reading and lots of writing with very little responsibility. So I just did that.
Just to go back to growing up as a kid, I mean, you talked about growing up in the Pentecostal church and how one of the things that drew you to writing and performing was that every Christmas and Easter you'd have to recite a speech, and that you'd get into it and memorize it, and you even became a youth minister in the Pentecostal church as a storefront church. How do you think that shaped you?
It shapes. It's the seed of language. It's the seed of how you hear sound. You know, how you learn story. Like I learned story from the Bible, right? Like my mother read the Bible to us every morning and every evening before we went to bed. I listened to her pray. I listened to my grandmother pray. So prayer became a way of thinking about language. Particularly, it's a lyric, right? It's a lyric endeavor, right? And it's also an endeavor. It's a future making endeavor. You're often praying about something you don't have or something you would like, right? So it's all about desire. So there's all these ways in which I was learning about desire, learning about
In what way desire? In what way? I mean, I understand about the language and prayer and but in what way desire?
I think we think of desire purely like bodily, right? But like spiritually as well, like what, and also bodily, right? There's a way in which when someone says, you know, dear Lord, I would like, or dear Lord, can you do, right? That's desire, right? That is a love letter, right? That is like that's no different than a sonnet in a lot of ways, right? You're trying to beseech
Mm.
someone, some entity to do and change your lot and situation, which is about pleasure, right? And joy. So for me, even though I didn't realize it then, they were teaching me a lot about like the stakes of literature, which is that we want something. And I heard that in the sermons, right? I could watch, also sermons were so transformational. You would watch people like come in beleaguered in many different ways, sad, addicted, um, sickness, racked with sickness. And something in the message would for a moment ameliorate that or give them the possibility of further amelioration, right? And so for me, all of that was like the building blocks, I think, of like becoming a poet and becoming a literary critic, right? Watching people close read, watching people think about language and what language can do. And it was always so seductive to watch people transform by language, right? And I wouldn't have said it then. I would have been like, oh, I just like the way the minister talks and people change. Or when the choir sings, you feel a thing, right? And you just know that feeling. And it's a beautiful feeling. And you want to be with that feeling. That's all I'm trying to do in poems is sort of play with something that I learned there, right? But moving in a sort of more social, secular realm.
And do you think of yourself as more secular, or do you still feel the influence of the Pentecostal church?
I think you can't shed the influence. You know, like a tree is always, you know, you can change the soil, but it still started growing in a certain place, and so that's always. And I don't want to reject that at all, right?
Mhm.
Like you might reject the doctrine or what doesn't work in terms of the faith practice, right? But I don't want to reject that. It's really hilarious to me. More recently, I've been asked to do like lay preachings
Mm.
by some friends that are Episcopal priests and poets. And so I did my first commencement address for the Seminary of Southwest, which is a local seminary here. And they asked me to do a preaching, and it was really fun because it's a form. Preaching is a form. The sermon is a form, and it was really fun to sort of occupy that form again. So I don't, you know, I you know, I don't want to reject anything. There's always a little something in everything, even if you've outgrown one iteration of it, right? Like there's always still something there to learn, to use, to play with.
In the first poem of your collection, Best Barbarian, you have James Baldwin singing the hymn Precious Lord. And thanks to you, I listened to it, and there's something so moving about it. I mean, as I understand it, Baldwin wasn't a believer, but you said that you were drawn to his vulnerability. Can you talk about that?
Yes, it's interesting because Baldwin was a youth minister, right? We forget that he grew up with a dad who was a minister. He himself, uh, before him breaking away from the church, was a believer. Uh, and but what I hear in Baldwin, we're so used to Baldwin the firebrand, Baldwin the wise. If we were like to like if we were like giving all the like soporifics like Baldwin the wise, Baldwin the great, Baldwin the master thinker, Baldwin the great debater, and we in that sort of oratory that has a certain type of ethos of someone who seems to be firmly secure in themselves. And to me, when I heard him sing, I heard a vulnerability. I heard something that you don't hear in the novels. You hear it in the characters in the novels, but you don't hear it in the novel. You don't hear it in the nonfiction the same way. And you don't even hear it in poems sometimes, I think. And it was so attractive to me because for me, it let me in, not only into Baldwin, but into a piece of myself, right? That sometimes we do get weary. Sometimes we're tired. Sometimes this world and what it is to be Black in this world, or what it is to be yourself in this world, becomes really overwhelming. And I love the fact that in the singing voice, you can hear that resignation in that sign, in that like playing in that, and just like allowing that to be. I think sometimes we try to be perfect or strong at every moment. And they're just moments when actually the most beautiful sort of moment would be us being our most vulnerable selves, our most tender selves, and relinquishing ourselves to that and allowing others to feel and see it and know it. I think that's something I want to sort of sit with as much as possible as a poet.
Mm. And tender self, I mean, that's the right word to describe it. But it's interesting that Baldwin's singing here, because another thing you mentioned in your acceptance speech was that your grandmother once told you that you were going to sing one day.
Yeah, you know, I grew up. My mother was also a choir director, and you know, we would have to sing in church, and I sang. And my grandmother liked my voice, but I think she liked my singing voice because she's my grandmother. Like, no grandmother's gonna be like, "Baby, you have a terrible voice."
But you really you said that you think you have do you really have a terrible voice?
You know, like
You
I
might
grew
have
up.
to sing for you might have to sing for us now.
Yeah, yeah. It's funny. What it is I think I don't think I have a terrible voice, but when you grow up in the like Pentecostal church tradition, you have to be someone who can blow out the church. You have to be the most excellent, right? Like if I didn't known what singer-songwriters were, right? Like if I had ever heard that Bob Dylan was successful, I'd be like, oh, I could sing, right? Because I can sing, right? And so like, you know, I didn't grow up in that tradition. So that's why I always say my grandmother told me, but she liked my voice and she always encouraged me to sing. She always encouraged me to write, to find beauty in the world. She's very vulnerable to beauty. Like my grandmother would be moved and would cry. And that was always so strange to me when I was younger because no one else around me would do that. She would hear something or she would love. And so, you know, now I understand that she just was a really sort of, she was a person in tune with what she felt. And when something moved her, she allowed herself to be moved. And so, yeah, she said to me like, "Hey, you're going to sing." I'll never forget. She looked back. She was like, "You're going to sing one. You're going to be, you know, your voice is really beautiful. You have a gift. Your voice is your gift." And I was just like, "What? This is," you know, and I'm glad she said that to me, because later in life there were little things that would show me, oh yeah, maybe this like singing via poems or singing via the essay or via the story is your thing. So I'm glad she said that to me. I'm glad she took the risk of saying that to a 6-year old, and would affirm it. You know, she would affirm it. She would have me memorize poems. She would bring home books of literature. Anytime she had an opportunity, some of the homes she worked in would discard books, and she would just bring them home, and she'd be like, "Roger, read these," or it would be calculus. It would be math, whatever the book was. I would just like try to learn what was in the book.
The poem that references Baldwin is called Grendel, after the fictional character in the 8th century Old English poem Beowulf. Who is Grendel?
That's a great question. I began to think of Grendel. You know, I've read John Gardner's Grendel, so the novel by John Gardner, right? And I was thinking about Toni Morrison's Grendel's Mother, right, where she says, "Evil has no father, but it always has a mother," right? And I began thinking about Grendel, particularly in 2020, 2019, as the sort of upsurge in the police killings, right? This latest surge in America, police killing Black men, and the way in which sort of, I think, there's a certain segment of the population in America that would see Black men as Grendel. If you look how Grendel's described, he's strong. He's his desire, his fleshly desire is too much. He can rip people apart, right? And if you look at the way Michael Brown was described by the police officer that killed him, he described him as this hulking figure, right? And so often, I think Black men are considered Grendels, and Black people, not just men, but I think women. This happens for Black women as well. And so Grendel is not,
because in the fiction he's depicted as kind of the monster, but then it's even that is ambiguous.
Yeah, I think so. I actually think so my supposition is that Grendel was a real person, as most mythological figures are, or story figures are, particularly coming from that era, and that he was probably African, right? Probably a group of Africans that lived, somewhere in Scandinavia, right? And as this sort of story gets told down into the British canon, he every time we retell something, it becomes bigger, greater. The fictionalizing of it takes on its own life. So I just wonder if Grendel actually was I think Grendel and his mother probably were real people, and they were different, right? And it wasn't that Grendel's mother didn't speak; she just didn't speak the language of those people that she was around, right? We know Black people, we know Africans were, people were just moving all over the globe, and so yeah, that's my posit. Like, if I ever wrote like the novel of, I would be like, it would be Grendel is a real person, and his mother is a real person, and a whole community. Because what I also believe is there's probably a whole community of people that were there, that were intermixed into, yeah, that time. So yeah.
Because later in your book you have another poem called Grendel's Mother, and in the original poem, as you say, she didn't speak, but you wanted her to, and you make, well, just why did you feel she had to speak? And then I have another question related to that.
Sure. Yeah, I think Grendel, like, it's interesting because one of the things I'm interested in is the counter narrative, right? Not right, and sort of what, not the what does the person that is not given, what does the person at the margins have to say about the same event that everybody else, right, in the center gets to write about, or there becomes the centering narrative, right? And so one of the things that I thought about, through Toni Morrison's, Grendel's Mother, her essay, is what would Grendel's mother say, right? And then thinking about the action actually of Grendel's mother it is connected to George Floyd for me. George killed in Minneapolis, because when Grendel calls out to his mother as he's being killed, she's far off somewhere else, right? So in some ways, she's like George Floyd's mother, who was called, right? She's in heaven. She has to come down. Grendel's mother has to come down to Grendel, right? And so to me, there was a way in which I was like, oh, there seems to be this connect for me, in that we call to our mothers in these times when we need power, right? They are, I think mothers are the first instantiation of power for many children, right? But like, generally, not all its cases, but generally a good sense of power, right? Like, I think about
And
protection, right? Exactly, which is when, like, a calming force, right? I don't think we often think of the calming force as a powerful force, right? We think of the destructive force as the powerful force, but the force that can calm, I want that. Like, I would love to be that force. And so I was thinking about, like, George Floyd calling his mother, Grendel calling his mother, and what might they say, right? What might they come from? And what, mothers, I'm a father, and I know what desires I have for my child, right? And I can imagine, as Grendel's mother is coming down to see her son, like, that's not what she imagined for him, right? She imagined many other things, beautiful things, the smell of things, the touch of things. And I just wanted to sort of think about what a mother would want in
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask, if George Floyd was in, and you've answered, was in your mind from the beginning, because you have the iconic words in that poem where he says, as he's dying, Mama, I can't breathe, and immediately we know what you're talking, what you're referencing there. just to go back to the first poem, Grendel, for a moment, there's a line there I want to ask you about, because, and this is in relation to James Baldwin, and it goes, I am calling to that grain of light, to that gap between his teeth, where the many of us fatherless sleep. It's such a striking image.
Yeah, I think I have the gap between my teeth. I think it's something that like Baldwin, he always smiled, right? He always like showed his teeth. And I think that was him. He had to be aware of the way people may have thought about being dark skinned and having a gap. And sort of, it's about embracing like the fullness of oneself, right? The fullness of one's face, because it's beautiful, right? He's a beautiful man, right? And then began to think about like the idea, like, so my father had passed, right? And Baldwin had to deal with his father passing and sort of complicated relationships with fathers, which is also in the book, right? Very much fathers passing, complicated relationships with father, which it can also, we can think about that as a complicated relationship with canon and tradition and Christianity and all those things. But I really was thinking about how this gap might be the place, right? Because it's also where like sound comes through, but it's also this place, a dark space in the mouth, where maybe something else can be there. Something like we can think about that gap as a nurturing gap, as a gap of possibility, right? And so it was just me playing kind of surreally, thinking about the cave and also the arm to be huddled and to be held. If that makes sense. Yeah.
Because there are a number of poems in this book, Cocaine and Gold, Rehearsing for the Funeral, After the Funeral, that evoke a father in different ways. And your own father died within 8 weeks of your first Father's Day. And you've made such a strong connection between his death and your becoming a father, your daughter's birth. How do you see that?
Yeah, so I didn't grow up with my dad like in the home. He would call us every weekend. I think between the ages of 4 and 18, I only saw him about once or twice because he lived in Alabama and we lived in New Jersey. Poor folks can't always, see each other. And so I didn't see him much growing up, but I had a regular sort of phone conversation with him. And so in my 20s, I got to know him. I got to know him. Part of moving to Atlanta was getting to know my father after I left Princeton. And I lived with him for a few weeks. That didn't work out. And
How old were you at that time?
I was 20.
Okay.
So I'd only, I didn't really know him. I didn't, but I was trying to forge this relationship, which I think was a good thing. And so fast forward, we build an adult relationship, and I'm going to become a father. And I was like, oh, my father never got to be a father, but maybe he could be a grandfather. Right? And we had been planning, my partner and I had been planning to take Naima, my daughter, to see him at some point within the first year of her being born. And so she hadn't yet turned 1. And I get a call on Father's Day. I'm out at Ravinia, which is this little venue in Illinois, and I'll never forget it. Monty Alexander opened. He's a jazz pianist from the Caribbean. He was playing.
It's just outside of Chicago. It's beautiful up in
Yes.
the grassy hills and stuff. Yeah.
Beautiful day. It was a beautiful April, I think, no, June. Yeah, June day. And then Joey Alexander was playing, and all of a sudden I get a call from Alabama, and they said like, "Hey, you need to come down here. Your dad, they're giving him 8 to 12 weeks to live." And I thought, oh man, I just knew he was going to be able to be a grandfather. Like, okay, we moved through. Okay, you couldn't be a father, but like being a grandfather was something that, like, how do I say? I thought I could control a bit more, right? Because I could put my daughter in his life. There was more money. Like we could take trips to Alabama, right? And I just thought it'd be a really beautiful relationship and connection. And then it was gone. Um, yeah, and that was really a really tough situation because I would want that, I would want that for her. But luckily, she has her grandfather still on her mother's side, and so it was a difficult moment, because it also meant that like that was going to be the end of the relationship that I had with him, right? Like we were still building an adult relationship. Um, so
Could you read your poem After the Funeral?
sure.
It's page 39.
After the funeral, a white cat has come to sit on the backside of slaughter, to sit on a white bull bearing a necklace of pomegranates. The cat has come not as any witness to a crucifixion or a coronation, not as angel or symbol of some comfort, creature, some benign break in the dying, but as human wish, as distraction from suffering. My human wish to keep my father's schizophrenia in his casket, to keep that below the earth, one from another, now and forever, in season and out, from mountain to mountain, in the trees and after. Amen. Everything has come back to prayer, sitting in that delay, harrowing the fixities, my father in me, and my clock, my hoof, my feather, in the sprawling armature and stars of I am. Lord, am I worthy? Have I devotion? What body built of flood, of cancer, of winter, of woman? Lord, I pray as I've been taught, to keep nothing from my tongue, its palm, its golden mind, so it bees and bees with whatever it bees. Rose, rain, Lord, even her who rises from this bed, the naked two-ness of her filling the room, such that she becomes the room. Lord, am I ready? How shall I bear the coming madness if it is to come? What disaster will I deliver to my daughter? My human wish, distraction, a white cat balanced on the backside of a bull, slaughter far off. This delay, Lord, this delay I offer, because I own neither houses nor land, have not 100 heads of cattle or of state, grazing on grain in a golden green field. Keep this coming distant, this sickness underground. And if, Lord, if I am to bear madness, become the father who scratches the raw earth with his hoof and snout, plowing the field as ox or ass, because the mind says, go, go into the pasture, not as ox or as ass, but go ox, go ass, then Lord, let me into the field, but make, Lord, diviner of the snowflake and master of fragments, a light, a golden light in a tree. And there have my daughter stare at its working, the darkness and the green, in the leaves and red blooms, while I, behind her, like the tines of a fence, and leap in the dust in front of a white cat that has become my master, that I follow out to a white bull bearing a necklace of pomegranates.
Thank you. How much of that is you, your father, and that anguished question, how much disaster shall I visit on my daughter? How much of that is you engaged with?
I think a lot of it is. I think this is something parents think about. I think for me, schizophrenia is hereditary and it runs my family. And I remember learning through various, because my sister deals with mental illness and things like that, that the possibility of our children having mental illness was really large. Um, and it's something that I've always thought about and grappled and sort of, yeah, something that's always on my mind. And my father, he was a really complicated person, really smart individual. And I think when I think of my daughter, particularly as a man, there's many disasters I think men can deliver to their children because of patriarchy, because of, sort of phallogocentric thought. And, if we don't embrace sort of if we're not constantly interrogating masculinity, we can be pretty terrible. Society seems to be okay with that. And I was thinking about that a lot when I was having my daughter, and just wanting to, and even now, something I think about is just wanting to deliver as little disaster as possible. And, you know, thinking about like how things are inherited. And then, yeah, I just didn't want, I hope, you know, the disease doesn't visit her, right? And I hope it doesn't visit me, because, you know, schizophrenia sometimes is a late arising sort of, you're in your 30s, sometimes late 20s before anyone is even aware of it, which is what happened to my father. So, yeah, that's what I was thinking about.
Yeah, no, except you're in the early 40s, so maybe you can breathe a little bit of a sigh of relief.
Maybe, hopefully.
You said that fatherhood completely changed how you thought about writing. In what way?
I always thought that I didn't have the right words. I was not putting the words in the right order. Um, and what I come to learn was the order that I was hearing it was the right order, if that's the way I heard it. And I was always fighting, I think, to have the quote unquote right order or the best order. And when I saw my daughter sort of come out and just be herself in so many ways, from her resisting diapers at times to her drawing, her first attempts at drawing, and her looking at things and making her own art, and herself, she'll tell you, she's like, oh, I'm going to be an artist when I grow up, daddy. She said this since she was probably 4, right? And just watching her just say, oh, I'm an artist. And even though, you know, it's good to learn from models, like, I'm not saying that, you know, we shouldn't sort of read what comes before us or study what comes before us, but it was really interesting watching her sort of so much sound right and be herself. Right? She wasn't looking to sound like anyone else. She was looking to sound most like Naima. And I thought, oh, that's how you do it. That's it. And so I would watch her. I remember there's a picture I've taken of a whiteboard that we have. She has a little whiteboard, and she drew 3 flowers on the whiteboard. And I remember thinking, these are absolutely like, it was just beautifully sort of made. And I was like, oh, and they were very interpretive in a certain way. And I was like, what I noticed, what I do is, when I see it, I think about how did that person make it. And I noticed she never erased anything. Every mark became part of the making of these 3 flowers. Even marks that at first I couldn't understand, she made it work in terms of the flower. And I thought, oh, that's how you make a poem. You make a mark, and then you see what the next mark is, and you allow all marks to add up to the poem. And if you sort of trust your hand, right, in some ways trust the way the words are coming, then it doesn't mean it won't need revision, right? There's a beautiful thing, which is, I know what revision is, and she does maybe she does know what revision is. She probably has some idea.
Not yet.
But I got to think about that as a way of making, where even if you're making a mistake, if they're all mistakes, then they all work, right? Because they're all mistakes, right? So if the line is not sonic, you know, like whatever you're deciding to make as the sort of presiding sound or the presiding intellect, if you just keep going with that, it eventually will sort of unearth or reveal something that I think is unexpected and surprising, which is what we come to art for. At least this is why I come to art.
You're so erudite in that when your partner appealed to you to write a love poem, the first thing you did was quote St. Augustine.
Ironic, right? Because St. Augustine was fleeing his love, you know, his love. Yeah.
Well, I think it was famously saying, "God save me, but not yet."
Yeah, it's so funny because all my friends that are like, one of my friends, his name was Travis. He's an Episcopal priest. He's like, oh, you bring up Augustine, but Augustine is the reason we have sin. He was like, we got to have to get rid of Augustine. I was like, I know, but he also had these. It's also beautifully written. He also has these interesting ways of thinking about things. So he was like, yeah, but we got to get rid of Augustine and sin. I was like, I agree. Let's get rid of the sin aspect.
Well, I mean, you do. I mean, to be fair, you do add Beyonce and Patti LaBelle. They show up in other poems, but Whitman, Orpheus, Dante, Ezra Pound. I mean, it's, I mean, I'm intrigued by some of the connections that you do make or find. I mean, not just Grendel's mother and George Floyd, but between Ezra Pound and Emmett Till via his father, who was imprisoned with Ezra Pound in northern Italy. So can you talk about that? I mean, how did you discover that, and what did it mean to you?
So when I was in grad school, I was getting my MFA, fine arts degree in poetry, and I was really interested in long poems. I was like, oh, I want to write a long poem. And so, the Odyssey and the Iliad, but I was like, I'm not sure I'm writing that type of long poem, right? And the epic, the narrative, and so, I just was trying to read as many long poems as possible. So reading James Merrill, The Changing Light of Sandover, and then I talked to a mentor, and he was like, hey, you should read the cantos, right? I was like, he was like, no, read the Pisan cantos first. And so I'm reading the Pisan cantos, which are, it's Pound being at his most modernist, fragmented self. And he said something about like Lewis Till. I was like, Lewis Till. And so I started, obviously looking at the footnotes. And then there's this whole thing about Ezra Pound being in the same prison camp with Lewis Till, Emmett Till's father, 15 years before Emmett Till is murdered, or 14 years. And I was like, are you for real? Right? Like that's a crazy collision, right? And anytime you see a collision like that as a poet or artist, you're like, we have to do something with that, right? And even though Pound has done something with it, and even John Edgar Wideman, the nonfiction writer, has done something with. And I was, before even Wideman had published any of his stuff, I was already like working with it. And so I thought about sort of, yeah, I was just thinking about that wild, and he called him St. Louis, right? So this is also another idea of Lewis Till that we don't have, right? That he was like good to people, right? Because he was in that prison camp for murder and rape. And so I was like, what's going on? Right? Like, this is a wild moment. And I just thought like, oh, it and then the only reason we know this, the only reason we know Ezra Pound and Lewis Till were in the same prison camp is because when Emmett Till was murdered and the criminal trial happened and the men got off, there was a civil trial where she was suing, in the civil courts, which you can get other types of restitution,
Mhm.
right?
Right.
But from my understanding, in a civil trial, um, the burden of proof is a lot less.
Right.
And so the defense on the other side decided they needed some evidence to show that this was pathological, that Emmett Till whistling at this. And so they basically dredged up a a file that was considered a secret file, a closed file on Emmett Till's father. And so I just became fascinated with this sort of history and the way in which these moments of history that we don't think are touching. Like, it's really dirty, right? Like, it's really overlapping. It's not clean. And I was like, oh, yeah. Um, and then also thinking about like as my father was dying, I was thinking about the things that I will never get to talk to him about, never get to say. And I imagine Till probably had things that he would have wanted to say to his father. And so I started thinking about this line from Frank Bedard where he says there's nowhere in nature we can meet. So I always think about like, if there's nowhere in nature people can meet, where can we meet? Where can we meet? And we can meet in the fictional space. We can meet in the space of the poem. And so I wanted to like sort of move us out of nature into the poem, and that long poem. So I know it's a longer answer, but yeah.
No, no, it's a complicated poem, and so yeah, no, it's you have an alphabet poem for Naima, which is also about your father, but you have another poem that's almost an ABCDery. I mean, it's a kind of sound poem, or at least it starts that way, called Drapetomania, or James Baldwin as an Improvisation, where you really push the language. Is this your form of singing, of improv?
I think so. I think so. Yes. Yeah. I think it very much is a form. It's also a form of being fugitive with form, right? It's an abecedarian, but it sort of gets caught up in itself and decides to do what I think we should do it for him sometime, which is to run away from it. as it even comes back to it, right? And it made me think about slavery, right? And drapetomania was the alleged illness that's enslaved Black people had when they ran away from their masters and they ran away from their plantation uh, during slavery, right? Which is crazy. Like they weren't crazy, right? They were very sane to run away.
Yes.
And so I started thinking about drapetomania, and to me, James Baldwin is always improvising off of what America thinks of itself. And so I wanted to think about him as a type of improvisational form, right? What if we could like think about James Baldwin as a type of song or a type of poem, right? And could we walk? And so if we would be thinking about that, I would think we would think of him as an improvisation. So I wanted to sort of take the form, begin in a way that's like, oh yes, this is the form of an abecedarian, and then sort of become fugitive, become a runaway slave with it, become improvisational with it, and begin to think about all the ways we can turn this thing. And so, James Baldwin is definitely sort of frame by which I do a lot of thinking, along with people like Alex Coltrane. And like improvisation is so useful to me as a poet, formally, politically, how I'm a friend. I think how I'm a lover, right? Like I think that like, we're mostly improvising, right? We've played this thing before, like relationships, but then you're like, this person throws something in, you're like, oh, well, let me adapt. Let me become this other thing. Let me find some language for this. Let me find another way of saying I love you or performing love.
So it was really great to have the chance to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This was so wonderful. And I feel, again, really blessed by your attention to the book, the way in which, like, this is a great conversation. It's beyond my dreams to be sitting here talking as a Griffin Prize winner when I think about people like Deion Brand and just so many. Kamal Braithwaite, like my favorite. Like I was like, yo, that guy is. I don't know. So thank you, Eleanor.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.